Good afternoon to the East Coast and good morning to the West Coast. This is Jennifer Schaus, and thanks for joining us in our Federal Government Contracting Webinar Wednesday series. Today's session is covering cybersecurity and CMMC. But just a quick blurb here about our webinars. We do host webinars every Wednesday on government contracting topics. They're complimentary and recorded. We post all of the recordings on our YouTube channel, which now has over 300 webinars, again, all complimentary and all easily downloadable. And we also post them on our website. You can find them on our website for the Wednesday webinars under the webinar section, and just go to the 2020 schedule. If you're looking for the sessions that we cover on the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, there is a special tab for the FAR webinars. In the interest of time, we do not take questions. So if you have questions for our speaker today, Matthew Moriarty, you can contact him directly, and his contact information will be on the last slide. A little bit about us. We do provide professional services for government contractors. We work with product companies, service companies, software firms, small businesses, mid-size and large firms, including publicly traded companies. And some of our services are listed here, ranging from contract vehicles, GSA schedule, proposal writing, contract administration, and compliance. You can find more about us on our website under the About Us section. We do have a networking event coming up at the Kennedy Center. It's Monday, February 10th in the evening, and currently we've got State Department and actually NAV Air will also be there to meet with our attendees, and we're expecting about 100 to 200 federal contractors to show up. You can register on our website. Tickets are required in advance. Our newsletter that goes out every Monday now reaches almost 16,000 subscribers, includes government and government contractors. You can get pricing information from us by sending an email to the hello@Jennifer Schaus. Okay, so now let's dig in here. As I mentioned, we've got Matthew Moriarty speaking to us, and he's with Co-Prince Law. The website is listed here, and he's covering cybersecurity, federal contractors' growing responsibility to secure data. So, Matthew, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm going to move to your next slide and let you dig in here.
Thank you so much for having me, Jennifer, and thank you all for joining us here today. I'll just get right into it. As an attorney, of course, the first thing I have to do is give the caveat. Number one, none of this is legal advice per se. I'm not allowed to do that. But also the caveat on top of that one for this particular presentation is that I'm not a tech guy, but I can tell you what the law is in relation to cybersecurity as it currently stands. And truthfully, the law is changing at an incredibly rapid pace right now. So we're going to go through what it currently is and how it's changing as quickly as this week, believe it or not. All right, so the landscape here is that the federal government is in the process of creating the infrastructure that contractors can use to do business with the government without having sensitive data escape. Currently, there is a nonprofit auditing body that has just been created that is going to start auditing federal government contractors for cybersecurity readiness. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Those standards, believe it or not, are expected to be released sometime this week. There's not a lot been out there in the federal government world about this, so you're in a position right now that you're hearing something that a lot of contractors don't know about. Next slide, please. So what are the stakes? I think everybody knows now that cybersecurity is hugely important, but you hear a lot about the Sony hack, you hear a lot about a Target hack, a Facebook leak, things like that. But the reality is small businesses, often like yourselves, are particularly at risk to cybersecurity threats. According to a study by Symantec, which is a company that works in cybersecurity, so take that with a grain of salt, 43% of cyber attacks were against small businesses. There's another study that showed that in 2016, over $1 billion was paid in ransomware. That is not stopping. Just this week, word came out that a large Canadian construction company got hit with ransomware. They're called Bird Construction, and they released the information that they made it through no problem. But we don't know if that meant that they paid, which is not advised by law enforcement, or not. The fact is, you don't want to be in that situation. Let's go to the next slide. So there is a lot of urgency coming from the federal government about this. The threats to you and to federal government information are coming from within the country and from abroad. I want to say last year. It's not last year. In 2018, China allegedly used a hack into a government contractor to learn some information about a weapons system. I believe it was a Navy missile system. But the fact is, any sensitive information at all going out is going to be valuable to both cyber hackers in the U.S. and cyber hackers abroad. The threats are only growing. China is not your only adversary here. Iran is a growing threat, of course, Russia. But really, it doesn't quite matter where the threat is coming from. All you need to know is that the threat is there. And you also need to know that the federal agencies consider a vulnerability to be information given to federal contractors. They can protect the information that they have, but anytime they give the information out, they are potentially allowing that to escape into the broader world. So obviously they want to prevent that, and that's what all these cybersecurity regulations are about. Let's move on. So this is a government-wide issue, of course. Every agency that you work with is going to be concerned about cybersecurity, but the driving agencies that are changing the law and the regulatory landscape are these players. They are the Department of Defense, of course, the Department of Homeland Security, the General Services Administration, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. We'll refer to them from here on out as NIST, and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, a new agency that came out of Homeland Security recently and is now a standalone agency. That just goes to show you how important the federal government considers this issue. Let's move on. So, most of the law in this area is regulatory, meaning that it is created by a regulation, not a statute. The difference being is that Congress has adopted a statute, and it is the law of the land. A regulation applies to the agency that adopted the regulation. So, it's kind of the difference between let's say the National Defense Authorization Act, which is a statute, and the general size regulations that you follow that SBA has enacted that you deal with on a day-to-day basis. DFARS, for example, is federal acquisition regulation. But there is some law. In 2018, I almost said just last year again, Congress passed and the President signed into law the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency Act. This act elevated what had been the National Protection and Programs Directorate, a sub-agency of DHS, into its own agency called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. That agency is somewhat the driving force behind the main changes that are happening currently as we speak. Next, please. So, the regulatory requirements, that's what we'll talk about now in this section. The Department of Defense requirements are probably the most stringent. We'll go through them now. There's DFARS. DFARS, as you know, is the defense sub-portion of the FAR. DFARS 252.204-7012, called Safeguarding Covered Defense Information and Cyber Incident Reporting, is one of the main requirements that contractors have to meet in order to do work with the Department of Defense. It implemented 4 sort of standard requirements upon contractors. They are to provide adequate security for covered contractor information systems. By the way, that's not top secret, that's not secret, it's just any covered information. So it's actually a lower standard than secret or top secret. In fact, the information that got out about that weapons system I talked about earlier, I believe was not even secret information. However, it was useful information to an outside entity such as the Chinese government. It also established benchmarks for compliance. It obligates contractors to investigate and report incidents of cyber threats to the government, and it creates flow-down obligations, meaning that some of these responsibilities are going to have to be kicked down to your subcontractors as well. Those of you who primarily do subcontracting, remember that your prime contractors are going to impose these requirements on you. Let's go to the next slide. This also is a Department of Defense regulation. It is the Compliance with Safeguarding Covered Defense Information Controls, DFARS 252.204-7008. This is the regulation that includes the promise by the contractor to the government that it is going to safeguard the information. That promise is, quote, by submission of this offer, the offerer represents that it will implement the security requirements specified by NIST Special Publication 800-171. We'll talk a little bit more about that publication in a minute. I can tell you that it's going away pretty soon, but currently this NIST publication is sort of the gold standard of cybersecurity readiness for the federal government. That promise, by the way, I've not heard of any contractor being found in violation of the False Claims Act by making that promise when they couldn't. However, that's on the table. Anytime you make a promise to the federal government and that promise is knowingly made falsely, you could be in violation of the False Claims Act. So know that by submitting an offer, you're making that promise. If DFARS 252.204-7008 is included in your contract, it probably is if you're working with the Department of Defense. And know that by making that promise, you are promising to comply with NIST 800-171. Now, you can vary from those requirements if you can convince the agency that you have greater standards than that. You have more robust cybersecurity than NIST requires. The way you do that is you ask the DoD Chief Information Officer for a variance, and the officer will decide. So let's move on, please. What is the NIST Special Publication 800-171? Well, it's called Protecting Controlled Unclassified Information in Non-Federal Information Systems and Organizations. There's a lot to unpack there. Obviously, it's not classified information, but it's controlled information. Non-federal information systems, that's your computers. That's what you have. That's where you keep your information on. So this NIST publication creates a government-wide set of cybersecurity standards. It is a very lengthy document. It breaks cybersecurity up into 14 families. It includes 110 security controls. This document is constantly updated, by the way. But the sort of takeaway, and once again, I'm not a tech guy, so I can't say these are the exact steps that it requires you to take. The takeaway from the NIST publication is that the focus actually is on a policy being in place, a process being in place, and configuring your systems so that they can protect information. So if I could boil down NIST 800-171 into one principle, it's have a plan. Know what you're going to do when someone attempts to take your sensitive information. That's a dramatic oversimplification, but that's my personal takeaway from this document. But I think it's a good way to think of it. If you don't have a plan, you don't know what you're going to do, the day you get an email with a strange-looking link in it, then you're not in compliance with the DoD regulations. There's obviously more to it than that, but that's just sort of, it's a good way for me to think about it, and I think it's a good way for other people to think about it. Let's move to the next slide. There is this misconception out there that these cybersecurity standards only apply to working with the Department of Defense. I think a lot of people think, well, if I'm working for, let's say, the mess hall somewhere at some agency, I'm not necessarily going to be required to have cybersecurity. Well, that's not necessarily true. There is a FAR regulation that we'll talk about in a second that applies to many contracts, all contracts, in fact, where the contractor might store or transmit federal contract information. So let's move on. The FAR says, FAR 52.204-21 requires a contractor to have basic safeguarding of covered contractor information systems. So essentially this is going to apply to all acquisitions other than commercially off-the-shelf acquisitions. These are minimum security controls. They are not, by any means, they are not like the gold standard. In fact, I'm not even sure if they would meet the level 1 auditing requirements. We'll find out more about that later, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. Let's move on. We'll talk about some of the FAR requirements here. So what are these procedures that this FAR clause lays out? There's 12 of them. I'm not going to get into all of them. There's 15, my mistake. For some reason I had 12 in my mind. So some of the procedures are protection from malicious codes, obviously. Updating that protection, what does that mean? That means have some sort of antivirus software. Perhaps it's more than that. You have to update your system to see what's out there. Scans of your system periodically, scans of your system in real time to ensure that your system is secured. Let's move to the next one. Some more procedures that this requires: verify the identity of your users. I think that is pretty clear. It means have some password protections on your devices before allowing access to them. You have to sanitize or destroy information before disposal or release. Let's move on. Some other requirements there on the regulation I have in front of me: just monitoring and controlling, identifying and reporting flaws in a timely manner, stuff like that. So please do look at that FAR clause when it's in your contracts, and know that you're complying with that when you do business with the federal government. So the big change that is happening right now is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, aka the government is going to audit your cybersecurity readiness if you're doing business with any of these agencies: the DoD, GSA, NIST, obviously, Department of Homeland Security, and I have a typo here that should be CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. They have formed a nonprofit board that will perform independent third-party audits of contractor cybersecurity procedures and systems. Next slide, please. By the way, there's no information out there from official sources, really. I'm cobbling this together from news reports. We do expect a release of some official information sometime this week. We do know that auditors will physically come to your business, and they will assess during that visit the sensitivity of the data you keep and determine a level of security that data will require. There will be 5 levels. Level 1 will be the lowest. Level 5 will be the highest. We don't know much about what the levels are going to look like right now. I think you can assume that level 1 is going to be at least FAR 52.204-21, which is those minimum standards. I suspect that it'll be a little bit closer to NIST 800-171, but we won't know until that comes out. As I said before, the nonprofit auditing body is in existence today, so the train is on the tracks. This is happening. Let's move on. So, as I said, this is moving very, very fast. Any day now, sometime this week, the auditing body intends to release its memorandum of understanding. Basically, that's what the requirements are going to be. Then in March, DoD plans to publish an assessment guide for auditors. How will the auditors determine whether these companies meet what level they're at? In the summer, you can expect to see CMMC requirements start showing up in your solicitations. That's especially true if you are working on some very sensitive nuclear or missile defense projects, but they will start showing up in all types of solicitations. And then this fall, the plan is to release the proposed CMMC requirements for public comment. By the way, just a few days ago, recently enough that I didn't have time to put a slide together for this, there was a survey released that said that only 1 in 4 contractors are aware that CMMC requirement is going to be happening. So count yourself amongst the lucky, the lucky 1 in 4 who actually know about this. Let's move to the next slide. So, reportedly, and this comes from Bloomberg. This is not, by any means, this is not an official number, but reportedly the cost associated with achieving level 3, so that's the middle level, is about $250,000. Now, according to the news report, that was how much it cost a particular business to get where it believes level 3 standard is going to be. I do know that the government wants most contractors or most contracts to be level 1. So as long as you're level 1, you'll be able to do most of the work. Theoretically, we'll find out more as this moves on. How much is this going to cost the federal government? Not that that's your problem, but it's going to cost a lot. The government needs thousands upon thousands of auditors to do this. So perhaps if you're in a position to assist with that, this is an opportunity out there. Let's move on. So we're getting close to the end here, but what I did want to say is that there is a lot that's still unanswered about this. A few questions that are come to the top of my mind is what if you get assigned level 2, for example, and you say, I'm pretty sure we're level 3. Are you going to have any recourse if your audit, if you disagree with your audit? What about the pass downs to your subcontractors? Are they going to have the same level cybersecurity as you? If you're level 5, does that mean you can only subcontract to other level 5s? We don't know the answer to that right now. What about the cost associated with coming up to these standards? Will you be able to pass that on to the government, or are you left holding the bag on this? I just don't know the answer, but these are some of the questions that come to the top of my mind, and I'm sure you all have a lot yourself. I think that's the last slide. Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Matthew, so much for presenting and giving us some great information to think about on CMMC. If you guys have questions about cybersecurity, government contracting, you can contact Matthew directly. His contact information is here, phone number and email. And this rounds out our January topic, which every Wednesday in January we did cover CMMC and cybersecurity. You can get some perspectives, get perspective from other speakers as well in our archived webinars. Next month we are covering OTAs, other transaction authorities. And then March we get into bid protest. And throughout the year we will cover additional government contracting topics. You can find recording and the registration links on our website. Again, everything is complimentary. Thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks again, Matthew, for a great presentation, and hope to see you guys next time. Thank you.